Hello everyone. So recently I've been asked by a couple different people to look at specific books or asked if I had an opinion on a specific book. So I thought for today's video I would do sort of a quick mini review on the specific books that I've been asked about recently, and then also talk about some books that I recommend, which might be a bit of a spoiler of my opinion for the books that we're about to talk about that I've been asked my opinion on. Sorry about that. So the first one, I actually can't remember who initially suggested I get this, but it's called The Fairy Way by, I can't say this name without laughing, I apologize, by Hugh Min. Clever pseudonym right there. This one was written in '96. It definitely is a product of its time. I was asked to do a specific book review video on this particular book by my friend Lisa Jade, who was curious about it. It is painfully 1990s paganism, this book. For people who are familiar with the sorts of books that were kind of coming out during that period by some of the pagan publishing houses. It is very freely mixing and matching and blurring lines between a lot of different sources. It focuses on fairies, hence the name, The Fairy Way, largely in an Irish context, although it does mention Scottish. It treats Scottish and Irish, the languages and the cultures, very interchangeably, but it also draws a lot on Buddhism, pulls in some Native American stuff, just very typical of what you'll see with a lot of 1990s pagan books, quite frankly. This is not one that I would personally encourage people to rush out and get. It is out of print as far as I know, so it's not one you're going to really find on the shelves. The author, as is often the case, does not seem to have either Irish or Scottish Gaelic as languages that they speak. But they do use certain terms from the languages. They're drawing on older sources for kind of how they're getting the meanings of certain things. I'm not sure if they're misunderstanding the older sources, which is possible, but they do make some claims that are just blatantly untrue, suggesting that the word she, Shia is how one of the spellings they use, because it's a feminine word, they claim. I'm not going to get into a huge linguistic discussion with Irish and Scottish here, but what the book says is because it's a feminine word, that therefore it equates to or means like female fairy specifically. That definitely is not true in Irish. In Irish it means fairy hills, and it's kind of come to be associated with the fairies themselves, the fair folk themselves. I can't speak as confidently with the Scottish Gaelic because I'm not nearly as well versed in that language, but from my understanding of it, it would be fairly similar. Both modern Scottish Gaelic and modern Irish are rooted in Old and Middle Irish, so they do tend to have a lot of similarities. One of the sources he does draw on, which another of my social media friends very helpfully kind of dug into when we were having this discussion on social media, apparently does kind of try to argue this, that the word she in Scottish Gaelic would sort of inherently imply a female fairy, but that generally isn't how the word is used. I've never seen it used that way. I most often see it used as the collective in the plural sense of, groups of fairies. But I've never seen a really strong gendering of it or implication that it must be female fairies only. So that's a bit of a difficulty. And then he suggests another word for male fairy, which, again, digging into it, it turns out is a Scottish Gaelic word, but it's a word that has some really nuanced meanings, particularly used for like a changeling or a troublesome elf, or it can be used as sort of a pejorative against a human man, kind of implying that he's sneaking around. So, and the author's trying to claim that that means male fairy, and that the other word means female fairy. So that right there is kind of a big red flag when you're in the first chapter, and the author's making these sorts of inaccurate assertions. Not good. The author's also very, very invested in the triple goddess motif, and assigns particularly Irish goddesses for that. Brige as the maiden, Danu as the mother, and the Morrigan as the crone. I mean, this is just my personal opinion here. I find that really problematic. We know from mythology that Brige has children, at least one, probably more like 4. Danu we know very little about. She is referenced as the mother of the gods in a story, fair. And then the Morrigan, you know, pigeonholing her as a crone, that's something I'm never going to be a huge fan of myself. But all of this, you know, the idea of having this triple goddess concept and using kind of randomly chosen Irish goddesses that were never seen as triplicities in that grouping in the Irish mythology, I think is also a bit of a problem. Not going to get into the exercises suggested in the book. There are quite a few. I obviously didn't do them, just because the underlying philosophies and concepts behind most of it, not stuff that is really going to work for me anyway. May or may not resonate for other people. Definitely not my sort of thing. And I will just say that I would take any of the language assertions, any of the cultural assertions in the book, with a really big grain of salt. If you do decide to give this book a read, or if you have it and have read it. The bibliography is kind of a roller coaster. There's actually not much in the bibliography that is specifically related to fairies or Celtic culture. It's just sort of this eclectic stew of sources. I believe Tolstoy's in there. So it's interesting. It's definitely an interesting snapshot of that time period for pagan authors. You know, the premise of it is creating an actual interactive path with the good folk. I'm just a little skeptical of a lot of the contents of it and the quality of those contents. Not something I would necessarily recommend if you're looking for a guidebook for actual pagan practice connected to fairies. Maybe look somewhere else. So speaking of looking somewhere else, my personal suggestions, if this is sort of the direction you're interested in going in, would be, let's see, Irish Witchcraft from Irish Witch by Laura O'Brien. There's a new edition of this one out. This is the older edition. There's a new one you can get that's been updated and revised. It's not fair folk specific, but it is spirituality that is rooted in that culture, Irish culture specifically, and that is sort of predicated on acknowledging and respecting the various multiple types of beings that are going to be around us. I think it's a really good place to start, and then you can kind of go out from there. Another one I would recommend, pardon my phone ringing behind me. Another one that I would recommend is A Deed Without a Name by Lee Morgan. This one is sort of set up in the structure of traditional witchcraft, but it very heavily draws on and includes the idea of the good people, the fairies, and how to incorporate that into one's active practice. So I think either one of those, if this is kind of the direction that you're interested in going in, either one of those would be better choices, quite frankly, than the fairy way. So I would personally recommend going sort of in those directions. The next one that I was asked about is a little bit of fairies. An introduction to fairy magic, and this is apparently part of a series. Again, it's a little bit of an older book, but I guess it's a fairly popular series. It's sort of set up, initially it gives sort of an overview of several different types of fairies, and then it goes into sort of how to potentially interact with them. It's very, very twee in its approach. It very much looks at all fairies sort of through that post-Victorian New Age lens. And, you know, it does sort of caution and mention, like, you know, changelings aren't really the best thing to try to connect to or work with. But for the most part, the descriptions that it gives of the different types of fairies are not what you're going to find in folklore. It also really leans into the idea of different elements being connected to fairies, and sort of the idea that all humans have to do is kind of ask fairies for things, ask them for help with things, and that fairies are just sort of hanging around waiting to help us, and will really quickly kind of enthusiastically jump on that. Definitely not my cuppa, as they say. It's not a book that I would normally recommend. I have to say, in fairness, that the majority of what's out there for fairy guidebooks, fairy Bibles, anything that sort of purports to be quick and easy access to a bunch of different types of fairies and then how to deal with them. 99% of the time when I've looked at those, they're not very well researched. They just kind of take that sort of dragnet approach where they'll take absolutely any and all information and incorporate it, regardless of whether it's actually traditional folklore or just something someone wrote on the internet somewhere. So, not necessarily the best way to go. I usually don't make a habit of recommending my own books. Just not my particular thing. In this case, though, I have to say that I would usually, at this point, recommend Catherine Briggs' Dictionary of Fairies. It is sort of the classic. It is your best bet for a really good, concise overview of multiple different types of fairies with the folklore related to them. It's exceptionally well done. It does talk about things like how to actually connect to these beings, different methods from folklore and folk magic and folk belief for doing that. Unfortunately, I hadn't realized until I recommended this recently in a group and it was pointed out, the book has been out of print for a long time. I did know that, of course, but I hadn't realized it's gotten extremely expensive. So it's really hard to find it at any kind of a reasonable price. And unfortunately, there's just not anything else on the market that is comparable. Like I said, most of what's out there is just not good. Not good resources. And I'm just trying to be honest here because I hate for people to spend money on books that are going to have information that's just not accurate information. And then, of course, that gets forwarded and continued. So this is going to be one of the rare instances where I will say that if you're looking for something like that, I did write a book called A New Dictionary of Fairies, which is sort of in line with Briggs' work and sort of the structure that she had in her fairy dictionary. So the idea is it's a list of multiple different kinds of fair folk, mostly from the Celtic and some related Germanic cultures. And it does talk a little about things like seeing fairies, fairy etiquette, things along those lines. I really can't think of anything else in that area to recommend. I'm totally open to suggestions. As you can tell from this video, when people ask me about books or ask my opinion of books, I do make an effort to try to get a copy or read it so I can have sort of an educated opinion on it. This just happens to be one area where there's just unfortunately not very much of any real quality that's out there. So if you have any you want to suggest, I am open to it. Most of the ones I'm aware of, though, just not really ideal. The last one I want to talk about, the Lost Book of the Grail. And this one, I actually had I believe it was a private message from someone asking my opinion of if I'd ever read it. At the time I hadn't, so I did get a copy. My opinion on this is going to be a little bit divided. So I really can't critique or comment on any of the Grail material in the book, which is clearly going to be the majority of the book. I just don't know that much about it. My primary focus is Irish, secondarily, to some degree Scottish. I do know some Welsh mythology and folklore, but honestly the Arthurian material and the Grail material is just not in my purview. It's not something that I have a lot of knowledge about or a lot of experience with, so I really can't say how well that's handled. I will say that I have heard from other people that the authors of the book are extremely good in that area, that they really know their Grail material, that they're sort of very on point with it. So, take that as you will. I will say, generally speaking, I would probably not personally recommend this book, since I was asked for my particular opinion. The Irish material that is included in it as sort of a cross-cultural comparison is not handled well, and in some places is presented in a way that's deceptive or inaccurate. So, for example, there's one point where they're talking about the Altram Tijas Yamerda Mether, sorry. The foster of the House of Two Milk Pails, I think is what it is in English. And the way that story goes in the actual mythology, it's a really good story, by the way. I recommend. You can find it on Mary Jones Celtic Collective if you're interested in reading it. The way that story goes is it starts right after the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods, have been defeated by the Gaels, humans, and have been basically driven into the fairy hills, the She of Ireland. And it sort of picks up initially by talking about some things going on with the three kings of the Gaels, which we're going to skip through in this retelling. But then it picks up with Manannán, who is sort of considered one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, but is an outsider as well. He is from the otherworld. He has an island in the otherworld, and what we would probably call fairy in English, Ansil Ella. And it sort of falls to him in this version of the story, to divide up the fairy mounds and decide where each of the Tuatha Dé Danann will be living in them, and then to teach them sort of how to live in the realm of fairy, as it were. Teach them how to pass invisibly in the mortal world, how to prepare a particular feast that will keep them immortal, things like that. And then it sort of goes from there to the story of how Angus Mac an Och wins the Sianboga Newgrange in English. And from there goes on to the story of one of his foster daughters and how she eventually loses her ability to live among the Tuatha in the Sidhe, and joins humanity and is baptized, and so on. So this is sort of the rough outline of the story. The way this particular book relates it, though, they use the term fairy from the beginning, and there's very complicated subject, the connection between the Tuatha and the Aes the people of the fairy hills, what we would call in English fairies. But it's very misleading to call them fairies from the beginning, because that's not what the story is talking about initially. And it also says at the beginning, in the book that I'm talking about here, that the story starts right before St. Patrick came to Ireland, and that Manannán had had some kind of vision of this, which is why he taught the Tuatha, although again the book calls them fairies, how to pass invisibly, and etc., etc. And that's just wrong. That is not even an inaccurate retelling. That is not what happens in the story. The story covers a span of time, but it distinctly starts right after humans have come to Ireland initially. And then a lot of things happen in the story before we get to the point where Christians are there. So I'm just really concerned with that, and with people reading that who will then think that that is actually how that story goes, when it's distinctly not. There's also some confusion at a later point when talking about Scottish ballads between Tam Lin and Thomas the Rhymer, which are two completely separate ballads. Tam Lin's name is not True Thomas, as far as I know anywhere, not in any of the original ballad material. So this all sort of combines to just make me a little cautious with this book. Like I said, I've heard good recommendations for them on the Grail material. I would just say, if you are going to read this, just be very aware that the particular Irish mythology and the ballad material that gets discussed is not being relayed accurately, or, just try to ignore it, basically. I already mentioned, if you want to read the original story, you can go to Mary Jones Celtic Collective. You can find a version in English, or Older Middle Irish, if you happen to be able to read it, on that website. I would also recommend, this is a slightly older book, but it's a good one, Folklore in the English and Scottish Ballads. This is from, I'd say, the 40s or 50s. It's just a really good sort of in-depth dig into the folklore that we find in the ballad material. It does talk about Tam Lin, and it talks about Thomas the Rhymer, and it gets into all of that stuff. So I would suggest that if it's a subject that interests you. Really can't suggest anything for the Grail material. If anyone watching this is really into Arthurian mythology or critique, please feel free to drop a link in the comments for something you would recommend. Just not my subject. So anyway, that it's a fairly quick review of a couple books and sort of my alternative suggestions for books that might be a better way to go if you're curious about these subjects in general. Hope that's helpful. I am always open to book suggestions if people have them. I really do pay attention and listen when people ask opinion or suggest I read something. Obviously, not a guarantee that I'm going to like it or find it valuable, particularly for myself. I do think it's helpful to just understand the context of certain books. So if you really like the idea of twee fairies, then the Little Fairy book probably be a good way to go. Not one I personally recommend because it's not my approach or my style. The same thing for the Fairy Way. Not my way of doing things. or my understanding of a lot of those concepts. So if you want to read it and you find that you like it, just, you know, keep in mind that a lot of the things it's claiming are that person's opinion rather than fact. Otherwise, you know, check out the books that I suggested and recommended. You might like those better if you like this channel and you generally find my thoughts and comments helpful. Those would probably be more in line where you're coming with as well. So I hope this was helpful, and I will see everyone later.